President Donald Trump has effectively abandoned a public health strategy for the COVID-19 pandemic. Critics say the businessman turned politician is showing clear willingness to trade lives for the Dow Jones. And the elections just months away, some say he's trading lives for votes. What does this mean for the country? From his utterances blaming China for the virus, we're joined now by Brooks Spector from the Daily Maverick, as well as Ronald Henwood. He's a political scientist and commentator based at the University of Pretrial. Gentlemen, good evening and thank you for your time. Brooks, I will start with you and this latest disaster of the president taking hydrochloroquine and erythromycin, saying, well, it does no harm, I'm going to take it anyway. Of course, putting the scientists at a very awkward situation here.
Well, it has, except that there have been no studies really, except for one outlier of a study that was done by a small group of patients in France that point to hydroxychloroquine and a combination of antibacterials as anything approaching a cure or a prophylactic medication or a curative. The fact of the matter is Donald Trump has been pushing this for some weeks now, partly, I think, because he really hopes to have an easy way of getting this solved, and partly because he simply doesn't understand the regimen and the rigorousness of scientific testing and medical testing. And if you're not familiar with how that is done, and if you insist on pushing particular medications because his gut says that they are the right thing, you head in the direction of a disaster, because there are a fair number of people in the country who will hear his words and say, aha, that's got to be the right answer. The president says so. In the meantime, as I think some of your introductory commentary pointed to, there is a major enterprise, a major effort to develop a variety of different vaccines based on differing ideas. One of them to interrupt the RNA, the nucleic acid that's in the virus. Another to encourage the body to produce monoclonal antibodies and various other methodologies. Work is proceeding in, I think it's 7 or 8 sites in the U.S. There is a highly touted version taking place in Britain, and the Chinese also say they're looking for a vaccine. What worried me rather a lot was when the president was in his presentation the other day, and he said, I think we'll get to a vaccine in 6 months or a year, but even if we don't, to slide to your second part of your talk, we're going to reopen the economy anyway. And that speaks to the question of just how much of this is intertwined with the question of his reelection chances, because at this point, the economy is in free fall or standstill.
Let's bring in Roland into that conversation as well. Roland, how important is the economy working for Donald Trump for the election November 13, I think, around that time?
I think it's of the utmost importance. If one keeps in mind that he has been the president in an era of strong economic growth, good performance, very low unemployment levels, and within 2 months, everything has changed. Massive unemployment, record levels of unemployment, the economy is basically at a standstill, and that is a huge problem for anyone looking for re-election. Keep in mind, 6 months away, so not much time, and I think there's a realization that the effect of this virus is not just a short-term issue, it's not just a health issue. There are huge economic implications, there are huge social implications, and it is going to play out in the election also. And that may explain somehow some of the actions and the reactions and also some of the utterances of President Trump. Although I think one must also allow for him in terms of who he is and how he acts. It's not just the election, it's also the personality and the way he does things.
Does it in any way, Brooks, explain his concern at this particular point? Firstly, the judge in Texas has allowed the mail-in ballots during this pandemic, but also we see the governor of Michigan and Nevada also wanting to go for the mail-in to make sure that it involves more people during this pandemic. Of course, he has responded to say he might even withhold funding for them if they go ahead with that.
Well, I mean, part of the challenge, and I think your listeners and viewers should keep this in mind, although the United States is one country, there are 50 states, and each of them have embarked in one way or another in a slightly differing version of the Great Reopening. Some of them have allowed increasing economic activities in an industrial and commercial way. Others have, because we're now approaching the early part of the summer in the United States, some of them are reopening carefully, gingerly, tentatively, national parks and beaches. Others of them are beginning to allow restaurants and bars, pubs, barbershops, beauty salons, and similar kinds of things to reopen with measures for protection, but nevertheless, the possibilities, because this virus seems to have about a 2-week incubation rate before people begin to show real symptoms, we don't know now just exactly how much of an impact this reopening is going to be. We'll know in about 2 weeks, and it could be not so terrible, or there could be what is sometimes called the second wave, of reinfection for some people and infection for others. And there are some scientists who say the second waves are usually worse than the first. So it's a real open question right now as to what happens once all the states begin to click along and all of the things that are being opened become open and all the people begin to have interactions with each other, whether or not they've been tested, whether or not they're symptomatic or asymptomatic. Would not necessarily be known. And not everybody is going to follow the social distancing guidelines and masks and the other provisions, because people tend to be individualistic, and there is a strong, stubborn streak on the part of a lot of Americans simply not to take any of this kind of thing seriously because they'd rather do what they want to do. It can be a virtue in the country in some ways, but right now it's probably a net negative.
Roland, the other thing that we have seen, of course, are some protests in the U.S. With some states wanting the reopening. Is the United States divided in this as far as the people themselves, but also the whole handling of the reopening, as Brooks mentioned, varying by the various individualistic nature in which the United States approaches things?
Yes, it does, although I think one must be careful to oversimplify and focus on an exceptional context. If we look at the global picture, we see divisions, we see differences in most countries that has been hard hit by the COVID-19 virus. And we see another element that is playing into this, and that is the sense of fear that seems to be permeating through all societies. And it is this context of fear, on the one hand, divisive understanding, reactions, and the divided response to what governments and leadership wants to do. And then I think in the context of the US, we see at this moment in time also to some extent, a politicization of the division. In other words, if you are a Republican, you are in favor of opening up. If you are a Democrat, you are in favor of closing or keeping the system closed down. I think that's an oversimplification, but that is often the image that is portrayed of what is happening, and that brings into the process an element of politicization, which makes it very difficult for anyone, no matter who you are, what you want to do, to get anything done. You almost have a situation of us-them recreating itself throughout whatever is happening.
Ronald Henwood, appreciate your time. Speaking on behalf there, based rather in at the University of Pretoria, as well as Spector of the Daily Maverick. Appreciate your time tonight.